So I'm sure everyone and their moms heard about the cottagecore aesthetic by now. We've all seen the TikToks and the news articles and the mood boards, but like, what is it really? I know I had the same thought when I first heard about it. Well, that's what I'm here to talk about today, so let's dive in. Cottagecore is an aesthetic that romanticizes rural and agricultural life. It centers the idea of a simple life and being in tune with nature. With the rise of thrifting, slow fashion, and the increased time spent at home, the cottagecore aesthetic reached its height in mid-2020. While there are many related aesthetics like honeycore and goblincore to name a few, cottagecore emphasizes slow living and the rejection of modernity. There's an emphasis on romantic notions and a Eurocentric and simplistic view on agricultural life, and it explores themes of the environment, food, and caring for all living things. The color palette of this aesthetic is very natural, so greens, browns, yellows, whites, and most colors that are found in nature pretty much. But what caused the rise of this aesthetic in pop culture? Well, I'm glad you asked. So yes, cottagecore has been around for a while, but I think I'd be remiss not to go back into the archives for this one. This is not the first time we've seen people want to escape into this natural and pastoral lifestyle, and it probably won't be the last. There's been many times in the past where the cottagecore aesthetic was popular. Going back to ancient times, ancient Greeks were really fascinated by this region called Arcadia. Living in the city of Alexandria, a metropolis that had more than 1 million people, it was naturally very dirty and polluted. A lot of the citizens used to get a nostalgia for a quote-unquote simpler time and turn to Arcadia as their escapist countryside fantasy. Fast forward a couple hundred years and we've reached the Renaissance. Landscape and pastoral art in the 15th century became increasingly popular. A lot of this was because a lot of Renaissance artists admired classical art and poetry. There was more of an emphasis on focusing on the background, and a lot of scenes took place in nature and depicted a pastoral life. We can see this in paintings like the Pastoral Concert or Sandro Botticelli's famous works like The Birth of Venus and Primavera. And who could honestly forget about Miss Marie Antoinette, the cottagecore queen? She had one of the most famous portraits, which was presented in 1783 and is the ultimate cottagecore inspo. It basically showed her with no typical royal clothing, so no ermine cape, jewelry, or elaborate hairstyle. Instead, she has this straw-brimmed hat and is wearing what would later be called a chemise à la reine. In the news covering the exhibition, the portrait described the queen as being dressed up like a serving maid and wearing the chambermaid's dust cloth. The dress Marie Antoinette wore was indistinguishable from a chemise, an item of underwear. So in the painting, the queen looked both undignified and indecent, and it caused so much backlash that the queen had to put out a new portrait, but at the time the damage was already done. The same year the infamous portrait was presented, she had an entire rustic village built as a place of leisure. So it had meadows, lakes, streams, cottages, vineyards, orchards, basically anything you could think of. It was a fully operational farm where the queen would host events, and she and her entourage would cosplay as farmers. As you can imagine, this was not a good look for her. So as you can see, there's been plenty of instances in the past where people have always wanted to escape to this simpler life. People in the past have used nature and have looked backwards in time to soothe the pains of the present. But now that we know this, how did the modern cottagecore aesthetic come to be? While cottagecore and nature-themed groups have existed since the early 2010s, the term cottagecore itself really started in Tumblr in June 2018, with the subreddit following 2 months later. People really gravitated towards this aesthetic, and it only got more popular as time went on. With the turbulent presidency, increasing awareness of politics among pop culture, a new focus on sustainability and capitalism, it was only natural that the aesthetic would grow as a means for escapism for people. And once the pandemic started and we entered that period of uncertainty, cottagecore exploded. So let's move on to the fashion trends of this aesthetic, because that's obviously like one of my favorite parts. Long flowy dresses and skirts are a staple of this trend. A lot of them take inspiration from past hippie and boho aesthetics. It's also very reminiscent of how women in the past would wear dresses for housework and labor. And obviously you need a dress or a skirt to frolic in the fields, duh. It's not the same in jeans. So layering blouses under dresses, or even putting an apron on top of that beautiful white dress, are some examples of the layering trend in the cottagecore aesthetic. And in order to continue to participate in the winter months, layering is a must. Patterns are a very important part of this trend if you want to spice things up. Some popular ones are gingham, stripes, paisley, florals, and fruit. And I know lace is technically a fabric, but it has patterns, so it counts. Overalls and pinafores are a nod to the workwear trend and how you sometimes need to get your hands dirty with this aesthetic. But instead of the typical denim overalls, you can always switch it up for a different or natural fabric. And you can always wear a pinafore instead of overalls if that's not your thing. There are so many different ways you can accessorize when it comes to cottagecore. Embroidering clothes or bags is a very popular way to accessorize and give your clothes a little je ne sais quoi. Straw bags and hats are really popular, especially in the summertime. And less is more when it comes to jewelry with this aesthetic, so simple gold or silver pieces are really popular. But who says you can't have fun either? Floral earrings or fruit-themed jewelry is really fun, and I find the more romantic the jewelry is, the better as well. And so many different shoes can be applied to this trend, like Mary Jane's or just a regular pair of boots. Moccasins, sneakers, or flats would work for a more laid-back look, and you can also wear a pair of sandals in spring or summer. We can also see the trends being replicated in high fashion. I would say the brand Jacquemus definitely embodies this aesthetic very well. From his spring-summer 2020 ready-to-wear show that sent models down a runway in a lavender field, his brand takes a lot of inspiration from South France and its countryside with straw hats and baskets and gingham prints. We can see this trend a lot during the Louis Vuitton Spring-Summer 2020 show as well, that incorporated straw accessories and floral prints. And there are plenty of different designers that have used cottagecore themed designs, like ruffles, florals, and lace on their runway shows. When talking about all the references people take influence from when coming up with this aesthetic, there are a lot to choose from. There's really no shortage of movies or TV shows that romanticize country living and leading a slow and satisfying life away from the city. The Studio Ghibli films are probably some of the most influential films that cottagecore regularly references. I mean, I always see posts everywhere about the scenery and animation of Ghibli films and how people would just love to live inside of one. And I can't even blame them because I would love to go visit one of the worlds too. But with the focus on nature and landscape views, basically non-existent modern technology, and how immersive the animation is, it's hard not to see why people like these movies so much and why people think of cottagecore when they see them. Some other movies I think fit this aesthetic really well are Alice in Wonderland, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, The Secret Garden, Pride and Prejudice, My Girl, and The Holiday. Some TV shows that I think showcase this aesthetic well are Winnie the Pooh and Anne with an E. Shout out to all my Canadians that were forced to read Anne of Green Gables in elementary. There's also no shortage of music that fits into this aesthetic. In the past year, Taylor Swift came out with Folklore, which furthered this popularity with this aesthetic. As music can be used as a tool for escapism, I think it's had a huge influence over cottagecore, and there are many artists who create music and music videos inspired by running away or living in a cottage, or even the domesticity of the aesthetic. I think part of the reason why these movies and TV shows are so popular are because they show a simpler time. It's easy for us to be transported to these scenes because for a lot of us, this isn't the reality we're faced with every day. It's nice to think of a space where you're away from the world's problems, and the only problems you're faced with are picking fruit or sewing clothes. The idea is comforting and peaceful to a lot of people, especially when the reality they face is the exact opposite of this. Unlike my other aesthetic videos, cottagecore is still in its height and will probably be around for a few more years. With the trend cycle becoming shorter and shorter every decade, we might start seeing trends come and go quicker than we've ever seen them before. I think it'll be interesting to see how this plays out and how long the aesthetic will last before it leaves the mainstream. I think with all the push towards sustainability and a growing political awareness in younger people, cottagecore really had time to flourish as a way of rebelling against hyperconsumerism and the hustle and grind culture in day-to-day life. I think lockdowns were an opportunity for a lot of people to reflect on the stuff they would like to do if they had more spare time. It was a time for a lot of people to discover new passions and hobbies that weren't afforded to them in the past. I don't really know what comes next for cottagecore, but I'm interested in seeing how it evolves in the future. In the meantime, I will be living my Studio Ghibli dreams the best that I can. See you guys soon.